afternoon or good morning to our West Coast attendees. Welcome to the Alliance for Health Policy's webinar, Prescription Drug Costs. Can Increase Competition Restrain Prices? I am Mariella Payne, Acting President and CEO of the Alliance for Health Policy, and I will be facilitating today's discussion. For those that are not familiar with the Alliance for Health Policy, we are a nonpartisan organization dedicated to advancing knowledge and understanding on health policy issues. Today, we are excited to delve into the broad topic of prescription drug costs and take a closer look at policies focused on generics and biosimilars. You will hear from three excellent speakers who I will introduce in a moment. Each will bring a very different perspective to today's discussion. We are very grateful to have them shed some light on this very important, critical, and evolving topic. The Alliance for Health Policy gratefully acknowledges the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation for supporting the Beyond the Beltway Health Webinars for Journalists series. If you are interested in joining the Twitter conversation, use the hashtag AllHealthLive and follow us at AllHealthPolicy. I also want to briefly orient you to the GoToWebinar platform and go over some technical notes. We've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desk in the upper right-hand corner. You can click the orange arrow to minimize and maximize this menu. When you join today's webinar, you are muted, and you will be throughout the presentations. Use the question panel to chat with us about any technical issues you may be experiencing. You may also send in questions you have for the panelists at any time. We will collect the questions and address them during the Q&A session. Finally, all of our presenter slides are available to download in the handout section of your attendee interface. On our website, allhealthpolicy.org, you'll also find additional materials that accompany this webinar, including a resource list, expert list, and full speaker biographies. And a recording of today's webinar will be available there soon as well. Our agenda for our conversation today, each of our panelists will give some opening remarks, and then we have saved plenty of time for Q&A. I think I need the next slide. Okay. So here, this is the agenda for today, okay? And then our panelists, let's go to the next slide then. There we go. So our esteemed panel of experts, joining us today, we have Robert Langreth, who is the senior health reporter at Bloomberg News. Robert has also written for Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and Popular Science, and we are glad to have him here with us to give a broad introduction to the current drug pricing landscape. Next, we'll hear from Dora Hughes, a senior medicine and health policy advisor in Sidley Austin's government strategies practice. She provides her clients advice on a wide range of policy issues, including the regulatory and approval processes for medical products. She also worked for Secretary Sebelius at HHS, the late Senator Edward Kennedy, as well as President Obama during his Senate term. And we are extremely fortunate to have her government and regulatory expertise with us today. And our final panelist is Samir Al-Saray, an Associate Executive Director for the Permanente Medical Group, in charge of pharmacy, adult and family medicine, risk-adjusted coding, revenue cycle, outside medical services, and the opioid initiative. Thank you, Samir, for giving us an on-the-ground provider perspective. And I do want to note that we had planned on having a fourth speaker today from the pharmaceutical industry, but unfortunately, he had a major conflict and had a last-minute scheduling problem, and so he cannot join us today. But I think we're in for a great conversation. And so with that, unless there's any, I guess we'll just keep going. With that, I will turn it over to Robert first to get us started. And Robert, you need to be unmuted. There you go.
Yes, I was muted there before. So hi, I'm Robert Langreth. I'm a healthcare reporter at Bloomberg News. I've written a lot about drug pricing over the last, really since 2014, so over the last 4 to 5 years. And I'm just here to give a quick primer kind of the very complicated world of how drug pricing works. Next slide. Okay, so here's some basics on brand drug pricing and how it works. So as as I'm sure you've noticed, if you've been paying any attention at all, brand drug, the list prices, they pretty much almost always go up. We had one drug that, a female libido drug, they reduced the price by half, I think last week, but that is an extremely rare occurrence. And usually when you hear about, a drug company saying when we reduce the price, usually what they're talking about is not that they've changed the list price, but they've increased the discounts to the insurers, the kind of off invoice discounts. And in the past, 2 price hikes a year, hasn't been uncommon for, especially during until say, especially through 2015. There was a period, perhaps around 2012, 2015, with particularly aggressive price increases. And so 2 price hikes a year in the past has not been common. 10 to 15% a year list price increases hasn't been uncommon in the past, and obviously we had more than that. Now, as you probably already know, some of the small players that have tended to have some of the biggest price hikes. I cite one here, the small company called Novum Pharma. They've a skin gel that rose 4,116%. But there's high prices, obviously, in big pharma too. Now, cancer pills, they routinely cross $10,000 a month or more, and monthly prices for cancer drugs have gone up considerably in the last 2 decades, decade or so. Next slide. I figured we couldn't have a webinar without one picture of Martin Shkreli. According to the files we have, his price hike in Daraprim, it's still up there with one of the all-time price hikes, or maybe 1 or 2 super obscure things that have gone up more than that, but not much. Next slide. Okay, so this is the complicated part about drug pricing, brand drug pricing especially. And so it turns out that there's these secret discounts or secret rebates that are negotiated in confidence with big drug benefit managers and big insurers, drug benefit managers such as CVS Health. And the list prices, they don't include these rebates, which are not disclosed. And the rebates can vary very widely from drug category to drug category. So, for example, diabetes drugs tend to have very big rebates, sometimes 50% or more. That would be drugs like insulin and that. But there's other categories of drugs, such as cancer pills, that tend to have very little rebates, and you cannot tell that at all by the list price. Historically, employers, insurers, they get most of the rebates, so the health plan gets most of the rebates, but the benefit managers, the pharmacy benefit managers have historically, retained some portion of the rebates. They've said around 10% for themselves. And that's been a big source of a debate recently, how much is being retained, how much is being passed on to the end customer, and that's been a big source of political debate. Now, we did an analysis. We found that in 2016, we found that most drug prices, we analyzed about 39 drugs, we found that most of them, even after discounts, the secret discounts rose faster than inflation. We found in 2016, looking at a 6-year period. Now, we haven't repeated the analysis, but at least last year, IQVIA said that the price hikes of brand drugs after discounts were actually, once discounts were accounted for, were slightly below inflation. Here's the other big thing you need to know about discounts is that historically patients usually have not shared in those rebates. So if you are uninsured or you're in the high deductible phase and you have to pay the full amount, that has often been based on list price, and that is another area of political debate right now. There's lots of pressure on insurers and benefit managers to start sharing the rebates. Next slide. Okay, so this is just a couple slides from the analysis we did in 2016, looking at some of the major drugs and rebates. And we analyzed 39 major drugs and found from 2009 to 2015 and found that 30 of the 39 logged price increases of more than double the rate of inflation. from 2009 to 2015, even after estimated discounts were factored in. This is Humira. This is the world's best-selling drug, and you can see that the top line is the list price, and it went for, I think, one injection. It went up from $762 to $1,728 in a 6-year period. That was 127%. But even after we included an estimated discount, the discounted price still rose way faster than inflation. Blue line's the inflation. Next slide. Okay, but so the Humira situation where even after the secret discounts, the price is still going up way faster than inflation, that's not always the case. Now here's a case, Humalog. It's one of the world's best-selling insulin products. Now this is insulin's been in the news for, vastly increasing list prices over the years, and that's been a big public controversy. But it turns out that at least if you're a health plan, you negotiate well, they've been able, the health plans have been able to capture a lot of this back. So Humalog, you see the top line, the list price has increased like crazy from 2009 to 2015. But after these huge discounts I had to pay to health plans and benefit managers are factored in, the actual price that the company Eli Lilly was getting did not increase that much. It was kind of a very small increase in line with inflation. Again, this is not what the patient is saying. If you're in your deductible or if you are not insured, you'd see essentially that list price and have to pay that list price. But this is kind of what the drug company is getting after the rebates, after the fact rebates it's paying. Next slide. Okay, of course, Trump, he has a plan. He's made a big deal about drug pricing. He has a drug price plan that he says is, quote, eliminating middlemen. But basically, despite what they say and despite the targeting of middlemen, his plan essentially, could preserve and even expand the role of the drug benefit managers, including in Medicare plan from the elderly. And when the plan was announced, biotech stock prices rose on news of the plan, in part because it doesn't include government price negotiation. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about generics because we were supposed to talk a little about generics on this. So generics, the pricing is very different for generics. Generics, of course, are a growing part of growing importance because they're just such a large percentage of prescriptions, well above 80% now of all prescriptions are generic. And I saw another figure that said it was 90%. So that's what's happening with generic pricing is very important. Are we getting the benefits of these discounts? Next slide. So basically what happens with generic drug prices, they go down mostly. The normal state of affairs is deflation, but that's sort of like the price that generic companies are selling it at to the wholesalers. And basically the list prices in generic drugs, they have very little to do with sales prices, and the sales prices of the generic drugs are basically hidden. They're kind of secret negotiations with a handful of small kind of wholesaler buying groups. Now, right now, the prices are deflating particularly rapidly. We even did a story on this in April that I linked here. But that's the fact that the generic companies, their prices are deflating is it doesn't tell you how much is being captured by the various middlemen in the drug supply chain. So it doesn't really tell you the full story. Next slide. So generic prices deflating, that's the normal thing. But sometimes old generic drugs, as you've probably heard over the years, have had mysterious price spikes. And now often this has happened. Sometimes you don't know why, but often this happens when competition goes off the market, either due to manufacturing issues or to safety rules. Manufacturing issues have been particularly acute in sterile injectable drugs. Those tend to be old hospital drugs, but they have to be because they're vials, they have to be manufactured in sterile conditions, and that's a harder manufacturing process. And some of the factories have gotten old. Had safety warning letters had to be shut down or slowed down, and that's sometimes resulted in one or two companies getting monopolies, assembly monopolies, and then the price goes up and stays that way for a long time. And there's also been a FDA safety program that's essentially given some companies temporary monopolies on old drugs. And the third thing that's going on is there is a Justice Department price fixing investigation that's been going on into generic drugs as well. Next slide. Okay, the final slide on biosimilars. That's supposed to be, the biosimilars are basically, these are essentially copycat drugs of like monoclonal antibodies and other complex biotech drugs. And so these are not many of these in the market yet. I counted the other day, there's 11 FDA-approved biosimilars for 8 brand drugs. Now, most of these haven't been marketed yet. There's 11 approvals, only, a few are actually marketed, and the sales impact is small. And basically, one reason is the brand drug patents. These complicated monoclonal antibody drugs often have lots of patents, and even though they can get an approval, that's not the same as getting on the market. Like, for example, over Humira's lifetime, that's a rheumatoid arthritis drug from AbbVie that's the best-selling drug in the world. So basically, AbbVie, the company that has it, has secured more than 100 patents to prevent anyone from attempting to copy Humira with $18 billion in annual sales. So that's why there's no biosimilar on sale, even though right now. And thanks.
Thanks, Robert. That was terrific, and I know there's going to be lots of questions when we move to our question and answer session. So thank you so much for that presentation. Now we're going to move on to Dora Hughes, and so I'll hand it over to you, Dora. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to start with thanking the Alliance for inviting me to participate in this important dialogue today. My charge for the next 5-ish minutes is to provide a brief overview on the efforts by the Trump administration as well as the Congress to address high drug prices. Next slide. I'm going to start with the administration. We can just go right to the next slide. As Robert just alluded to, about a month ago, as you may know, President Trump held a Rose Garden ceremony at which he was joined by the Health and Human Services, or HHS Secretary Alex Azar, to discuss the problem of high drug prices and their proposed solutions to address them. As the president said during this speech, it is time to derail the gravy train, and he assured the American people that prices will come down. As part of this event, next slide, they released the blueprint entitled American Patients First. And it had a number of proposals that could be categorized into 4 main themes that I'll focus on today. First on the list, and relevant to our discussion today, increasing competition in drug markets. And as one example, accelerating the approval of generic drugs would be a prime one. The second theme, giving private plans more tools to negotiate discounts for Medicare beneficiaries. And as an example of one of those proposals, the administration is contemplating moving some drugs that are covered currently under Medicare Part B to Medicare Part D so that discounts can be negotiated. The third theme was providing new incentives for drug manufacturers to reduce list prices. An example of one of these, Secretary Azar has mentioned that perhaps they will require manufacturers to disclose the prices of the drugs in the direct-to-consumer advertising, with hopes that this would encourage patients not to ask for those drugs and perhaps seek out a lower-cost alternative. And the fourth theme, cutting consumers out-of-pocket costs. And as one example that they mentioned was encouraging pharmacists to let patients know when drugs that are not on their Part D plans may actually be cheaper for them. Next slide. And I just wanted to, actually, moving back to the last slide, the blueprint, they had included a number of questions, and they are taking comment. The comment period will close on July 16th. The final note I would make is some of these proposals, HHS can use its existing authority to implement, but others may require new authority from the Congress. And so now, next slide. I would say that although the White House has recently elevated this issue, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, has been leading this charge for some time now. In recent months, the Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, has startled the drug and device industry, health plans, pharmacy benefit managers, all of the stakeholders with some fairly tough talk about kabuki drug pricing schemes, difficulties that patients face with exorbitant out-of-pocket costs. This has certainly not been the traditional role or focus for the FDA in any administration, and especially would not be expected for a Republican administration, which historically has maintained closer ties to industry. Next slide. The FDA kicked off its efforts formally last July with the announcement of a drug competition action plan. The plan is fairly comprehensive, but I will cover a few of the actions right now. One, I believe Robert mentioned briefly that the FDA is maintaining a list of drugs that are off patent, but for which there is no other alternative drug generic drug approved, with hopes that that will encourage manufacturers to develop a generic. FDA is also accelerating review of generic drug applications. It approved over 1,000 generic products last year alone. REMS, or risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, is another hot button issue. As you may know, REMS is a drug safety program that the FDA can require for certain medications with certain safety concerns. The problem with REMS right now, why people are talking about it, is that generic drug companies need thousands of samples to do FDA studies for approval. Some brand name companies are blocking access to these samples, allegedly because of the safety requirements contained in the REMS. FDA is saying not so, and this is just a blocking competition, and they're taking steps to address that. Of note, there is a bill introduced in the Senate and the House, the CREATES Act, which would also take on the REMS competition blocking movement as well. Finally, on this list, I would also highlight that FDA has proposed a biosimilar innovation plan. Robert mentioned there's 11 biosimilars approved by FDA. Only about 3 have hit the market. And this is another big issue. Commissioner Gottlieb is doing what he can on the regulatory process side, but he has been hugely outspoken about the reimbursement challenges that are stymieing biosimilar development. And so what's this issue about? Very simplistically, if PBMs and health plans can guarantee a certain volume of prescriptions or preferred status on formularies, the biologic manufacturers, the brand name manufacturers, will offer substantial rebates and discounts. The PBMs and the health plans, they are not going to jeopardize these potentially huge financial savings to cover a new biosimilar that is being used by a very small number of patients. And so manufacturers simply don't have a major incentive to go through the difficult FDA approval process and the major expense of developing a biosimilar if there's no assurance of coverage and adequate reimbursement on the back end. Next slide. So certainly, even though FDA has taken the lead, there's a number of proposals contained in the administration plan as well as underway affecting other agencies. This slide is giving short shrift, admittedly, to CMS's efforts, but I would mention a few of them there. The president has suggested capping beneficiaries' out-of-pocket costs for prescription drugs over Part D after they reach $5,000. As another example, he's encouraging the pharmacists, again, to let them know if there's cheaper alternatives approved. They are also suggesting that perhaps Medicaid does not have to cover all drugs in exchange for the rebates. Perhaps they could experiment with closed formularies that would provide additional negotiation leverage. HRSA proposal, the main one here, the administration has really whacked the 340B drug discount program. This program provides discounts on outpatient drugs for certain health centers and hospitals. We expect to see more movement in this space as well. Next slide. Moving on to the Congress, next slide. I've included information in a few slides, but I would simply say that really the Congress's attention is all opioids all the time, and that's understandable, of course, given the epidemic. But they really haven't done too much with drug pricing in 2018. Over the past year, they've had a slew of hearings, doing a lot of examining various aspects of the problem, as you can see by the titles. But frankly, notwithstanding the CREATES Act that's looking at the REMS issues, there hasn't been a lot of action to date. Next slide. I would note that even though both Republicans and Democrats agree that this is a problem, the Democrats have certainly are pushing the administration to be more aggressive. At the time that the Trump administration released its plan, the Democrats released a better deal. They noted that even back in the campaign, the president had supported price negotiation and importation. He no longer supports either of these proposals, but the Democrats are saying we should negotiate prices. There should be greater transparency. There should be justification for prices. And also of note, they're calling for a new quote-unquote price gouging enforcer, who would be a director of a new and independent agency with authority to investigate, impose fines, and so forth. Next slide. And even, of course, within the Democratic Party, I would You'll hear a lot, in particular from Senators Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts and Tina Smith from Minnesota. They've been quite pointed and directed in their criticisms. They have described the president's proposals as inadequate, and also is certainly getting quite a bit of news. The president had said that a number of manufacturers would voluntarily lower the list prices for their drugs, and they have noted that none of the companies have done so and requesting a status update on that. Next slide. Finally, I would just say just Tuesday of this week, the HHS Secretary Azar went to the Hill. There was a hearing before the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. I would fair to say one of the news articles described it as not a lot of love for the proposal. But again, I think that this reflects that the Congress's focus is elsewhere. They haven't been working closely with the administration on drug pricing issues just yet. And also, frankly, some of the hearing was focused on drug pricing was overshadowed by concerns with the latest ACA challenge and the decision by the DOJ not to defend the ACA with particular focus on the protections for individuals with pre-existing conditions. And so the main question where we are right now is how will the Congress respond? We don't know just yet. Will it support the president's agenda, or will it move forth and develop and push forward on its own legislative agenda? Only time will tell. And so with that, I will turn it over to Samir. Thank you.
Hi, this is Mariella, and I just want to say to remind everyone that you can submit questions at any time, at any point. We've got several questions, but more than several that are starting to come in. So please add your question to that list. Thank you so much, Dora. That was an incredible presentation, lots of information there. And we're now going to turn it over to Samir for his presentation. Thanks so much.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Samir Ausre. I'm an internal medicine physician, and I still see patients in my office in Campbell, California. I just wanted to say that the drug pricing system in our country is absolutely broken. I think there's something simply wrong when the average price of a specialty drug is over $53,000, and it actually exceeds the median household income in the United States. So if you could actually go to the next slide, I'm talking about that one. So not only are specialty drug prices high, but the average price for brand name drugs also increased by over 200% from 2008 to 2016. And Robert briefly alluded to this as well, that generic drug prices went up as well. From 2013 to 14, in just 1 year, over 222 generic drug prices actually doubled. Our colleagues in pharmaceutical industry will tell us that the drug prices do need to be high because it actually supports innovation and research. However, you'll note that over half of the research dollars really come from the taxpayers. Places like the National Institutes of Health, local and state government, academic institutions like here in California, the University of California, which is subsidized by the state, and several other charitable organizations actually contribute to that. So if half the research is actually supported by the taxpayers, then why do we have the privilege of paying the highest drug prices in the world? Robert actually brought up Humira, which is the highest selling drug in the world. And as you can see, it is sold at a much lower price than many places in the world, including Europe. So the United States then gets the privilege of paying over 500% for this drug compared to some other drugs. Could you go to the next slide, please? So high drug prices are actually affecting the decisions my patients are making. And I'm going to share with you a couple of examples of what has happened either to my patients or patients of colleagues. I'll give you an example of one of my patients who has pretty bad congestive heart failure, and she's on numerous medications. And as it turned out, she ended up in the emergency room, not in good control of her heart failure. And when we had a chance to talk to her some more, she said, She's actually taking her pills every other day because she could not afford those. And so here it is, my patient putting her life at risk, showing up in our emergency room, getting admitted to the hospital. So not only is it bad quality care for her, but the cost to the healthcare system now goes up when our patients are ending up in venues that they should not be in, could be safe at home. Another example that alarmed me is for pre-exposure prophylaxis. As you may know, there are drugs now available that people can take to prevent HIV disease. And these drugs are so expensive that patients now are wondering, can I take my PrEP, or do I now expose myself to HIV infection? Actually, I had one patient who said he found the drug in Thailand for a really cheap price, and there was no way for us to tell whether the quality of the drug was good or whether it was even a real medication. So as a physician, this really puts me in a tough position because on one hand, I think I'm advising my patients to do certain types of treatments, but I have no guarantee that they're actually going to follow through. And this is seriously affecting their lives, and mainly because of these high costs of drugs. So if you'd go to the next slide, I want to talk about potential solutions because there's a lot of finger pointing in different places, but we really need to solve this issue on behalf of our patients and our country. Dora briefly mentioned transparency, and you might say, well, what the heck is that? Today, if you go onto the internet, you can find information on almost anything. So I practice at our Kaiser Permanente Hospital at Santa Clara. You actually went onto the website for quality. You can find out how well our hospital does in terms of heart attack care, pneumonia care, etc. All of the data for our physicians is now on websites. So people like the NCQA or HEDIS can tell you how good our physicians are in controlling diabetes or taking care of blood pressure or giving asthma treatment. So all of this is available today and open to people to look at. Pharmaceutical prices tend to be a total mystery, and there is no indication of how a particular drug is priced. And I'll give you an example of Gilead. Gilead came out with actually they didn't come out with the hepatitis C drug. They bought a pharmaceutical company called Pharmasset, and they paid $11 billion for that drug company. Within the first 3 quarters of a calendar year, they had actually recouped the entire cost of that purchase. So not only did they not do research and development, they had no idea, they could not explain to us or the public why they were charging $1,000 for their pill. So I believe that drug companies really need to be transparent about what their pricing is and why they increase their prices. The other area that we could really look at is competition. And we really do pride our system with the free market economy that we have. But I would say in the area of pharmaceuticals, this competition process is really broken. And what we see is really shadow pricing. And what do I mean by that? So if you remember, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, those flat screen TVs came out. And if you tried to go buy one of those, they were like $10,000. They're really expensive. And in 4 or 5 years, they dropped to $5,000. And today you can go to your neighborhood electronics store and get one for $300 to $400. So competition actually brings the prices of things down. So let's look at multiple sclerosis drugs. When the first one came out, it was $10,000. Today, there's 15 multiple sclerosis drugs. And guess what they are today? Almost $60,000, including the one that came out at $10,000. So in terms of drug pricing, actually, competition does not seem to work, and all we see is shadow pricing. And the third thing I would ask you to consider is actually value. So when we get drugs that cure hepatitis C 95% of the time, that actually provides great value. When we have drugs that prevent HIV, that gives us value. When we have drugs that take care of heartburn and the patent is going to run out, and now we change it into a slightly different molecule and change the color of it, and we jack up the price and create an artificial shortage of the first drug, that actually has no value. So those are just some of my thoughts and concerns from behalf of my patients. And really, I think we want to invite our pharmaceutical industry colleagues to the table so that we can take care of this issue together. Being part of an integrated delivery system, which is Kaiser Permanente, we get a single premium for our members, and we have to use it to pay for our physicians and nurses, to build hospitals, to buy our MRI machines or the next technology. And what we're noticing is that the price of drugs is taking a bigger and bigger piece of that pie. And today in Northern California, the price of pharmaceuticals has actually exceeded what we pay our physicians. And we're really concerned it's actually going to exceed the cost of hospital care. So again, I think this is a crisis in our country. Our patients really want us to do something about it. And I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I think we've had a great, different and interesting perspectives on the issue that we're tackling today. Again, I want to apologize that our fourth speaker scheduled for today and unfortunately wasn't able to do this at the last minute. He was the pharmaceutical company perspective. So again, I apologize for not having his perspective here today, or their perspective. Before we get started, we've got a lot of questions, and again, I want to remind everyone, please continue to submit questions, and we will be asking as many as we can. But before I get started on those questions, I'd like to ask Samir, if you could just sort of, we've got a range of folks on today's call, and I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit of the difference between what is it between a generic and a biosimilar, and why they have different, right now, different experiences in trying to bring down the prices of drugs, and just fundamentally what's the difference between a generic and a biosimilar.
Yeah, so I'm not a pharmacist, but the way I understand generics is it's the identical molecule. So if I have aspirin made by one manufacturer, I can have aspirin made by the second manufacturer. When I look at a biologic, it actually is an antibody, and there is, cell cultures and things that a particular pharmaceutical company may own. So the biosimilar will be a little bit different. I mean, it will have the same kind of properties to treat things, but it will not be an identical molecule. It'll be a newer molecule, and it could even be a bio better as far as we know. But that is the difference between the two. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry, I missed that.
I think there's some hope that biosimilars will play a similar role that generics have played in lowering the price of medications. But so far,
Right.
Given the slow process of actually getting drugs to market, that doesn't seem to be playing out.
So one thought is that there aren't as many. So often when there's 2 or 3 generics, there is competition and the price goes down. Today, there is a single biosimilar. And as Donna mentioned, it is tough for some of the biosimilar companies to really get the market share. And what happens is often there is patient loyalty that is involved because we have, medication already working, and physicians are afraid to now convert the medication. Hang on a second, I'm getting a lot of noise outside my door here. Let me see if I can ask them to move here. Okay. Big health system like us and Kaiser Permanente, we can give you an example of Neupogen, which is used after chemotherapy to help with increasing white blood cell counts. When the first biosimilar came out, Zarzio, and our physicians were able to look at the evidence and see that they were equivalent, we were able to completely move that market share. I think we have been leading the nation in Kaiser Permanente with using biosimilars because we can get our clinicians to look at the evidence and talk to our patients and move them to a different product, which I think does not happen outside.
Thanks. George, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. In addition to patient loyalty, physician loyalty, I think the FDA is recognizing there's a need for greater education for providers to make sure that any concerns that they may have in terms of switching and the impact on health can be explored. And the final note I would say is that in addition to federal policy, we do have to think about what's happening in states. A number of states have laws that allow or require a pharmacist to automatically substitute a generic drug for a brand name drug if such a generic product exists. In the case of biosimilars, the states do not have the same. Some states do not have the same laws, or they actually go further in saying that you cannot automatically substitute a biosimilar for a brand or biologic drug, and so then that becomes another difficulty for manufacturers of biosimilars who are trying to get a toehold in the market, and that's another issue that I think is going to get greater scrutiny as we have more biosimilars that come onto the market in the coming years.
Robert, do you want to add to that as well?
I would just basically say there's, not that many biosimilars that are actually marketed yet. It's relatively few. The ones, a handful that are out there, like Remicade biosimilars, so far, haven't gotten a big market share. So, pill generics, they're very simple molecules. After a couple of years, you often, some of the big drugs, you often have literally 5 or even 10 generic versions competing directly, and that really drives down the price a lot. When there's only, 1 or 2 competitors, that this is a situation now with biosimilars, that often becomes, more of kind of a more similar to a market share battle between like 2 brand drugs. And the price, doesn't come down that much. Even with pill drugs, there's only 1 or 2 generics on the market, then there are some situations like that. The price doesn't come down that much. It really starts coming down when you get to 5 or 6, a whole bunch of competitors, and that's what really drives it down. We have not yet seen that with biosimilars, and it's, and they've been slow to actually hit the market in part because of lawsuits and complex legal challenges. So there's just not that many yet. It's been slow.
Great. Thanks.
Robert, it's interesting you mentioned Remicade. I don't know if you're aware that the makers of Remicade actually paid the Korean pharmaceutical company who's making the biosimilar to stop introduction to the United States for 1.5 years.
Okay, so I have a question now from one of our attendees. One idea that was discussed at the Senate Health Committee was to use other countries as a reference price for setting U.S. drug prices, such as including a best price provision in Medicare that would incorporate European countries, also known as a most favored nation pricing. What do the panelists think of this approach? Secretary Azar was skeptical that this approach could work in the United States. You want to start, Robert?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that approach. I know it's been talked about for a long time. So I'll really leave that to the other panelists. I know that idea has been, out there forever. So I guess it's possible, but hasn't taken off in the U.S.
Dora, do you want to comment on that?
First I would say I was glad you started with Robert, but second, so yes, the president's been pretty outspoken about. I think he's described it as foreign freeloading and lamenting that we pay the highest prices in many cases for drugs compared to other developed countries, and how do we kind of level the playing field? But that's using a metaphor for a completely different issue in many ways. I think that, frankly, we're just at the beginning of learning more about what the administration is proposing and what would be possible. I didn't even mention it. The Trump's American First Blueprint, it does have some part of the narrative is about this issue in terms of the disparity in prices between the U.S. and other countries. I just feel I'm kind of with Robert. It's just something that we're just starting to discuss in any serious fashion within this administration and the Congress. That unfortunately at this point we just don't have a lot of details to share. But one thing that we didn't discuss before I turn over to Samir to hear his thoughts. One of the issues though in terms of reference pricing, it's not exactly the same, of course, but there has also been discussion about how can we look at value-based pricing? Is there indication pricing? What are some of the creative arrangements that we're seeing now between some manufacturers? Believe Novartis has one such deal. And what more can we do in that sense to make sure that the pricing does reflect the value of the drug for the population that it's being served for? And I do think that is the area that we're going to see increasing CMS involvement, as well as, frankly, in the Congress. I'm not so sure when you get to some of the anti-kickback statute issues that HHS has all of the authority that it needs to do this. But I do think it has the potential to save, to lead to some savings. I'm not sure how significant, but that is a area I think that merits further investment.
Samira, any thoughts? Again, I can repeat the question, but it was basically along the lines of using other countries to help us set better prices here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, other countries have an option of directly negotiating with the drug companies, as most of these places have national health systems that do have that opportunity. And I don't know that we have that. So I don't know that we need their reference prices. I think we should have transparency about what it costs and, what kind of good discounts that we can get here ourselves. I mean, if you look at what the federal government spends through Medicare and Medi-Cal, it's almost 50% of the healthcare system, and not giving them any opportunity to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies makes no sense.
Well, let me just build on that, because we have a question actually from several of our webinar attendees who are wondering about the ability of Medicare to negotiate prices and if that would have a significant impact overall in the market, and could it affect other payers as well. So you want to start with that one, Samir, to build on, I think, what you just outlined.
I don't think it's ever been tried in this country, but I'm assuming they should, right? Because if they purchase a high volume of drugs and they do have that opportunity to negotiate, I assume they would be able to do that. We definitely are able to do that as a large healthcare system. Kaiser Permanente has over 11 million members nationally, and we are definitely able to go to pharma and try to negotiate a good price. I know that current law allows then the Medicaid programs and the Department of Defense and VA to get the same sort of pricing. So sometimes the work has been done by someone else, but yet sometimes pharmaceutical companies are reluctant to negotiate, because now if they give Kaiser Permanente a discount, they're now going to have to pass it on to everybody else. So they're not keen on negotiating a large discount.
Dora, what about you? What's your thoughts about allowing Medicare to negotiate directly on drug prices?
I think that is an area that people have long thought about. I know that some of the legislative proposals have not been scored in terms of having significant savings, but that's important because in order for the negotiations to be maximally effective, you would need to likely have Medicare would also need to have the ability to restrict certain drugs from being on the formulary. And that's what's done in the private plans, to the extent that if you want to be on formulary, you may have to provide a greater discount than you otherwise would. And so, in particular with drugs that are part of the 6 protected classes of Medicare, for example, some oncology products, mental health products, other drugs for HIV/AIDS treatments, historically these drugs are considered to require a special status because they're patient populations are perhaps among the most vulnerable patient populations, and so these drugs have enjoyed full coverage with minimal restrictions over the years. But because of that, they also are less likely to face any meaningful pressure for discounts and so forth. And so some of the conversation right now is like, well, perhaps we should revisit that. Maybe if we do insist on some discounts in return for continued coverage, or if there's some restrictions around the edges, then we could get some greater discounts. And I also think that the same is happening with Medicaid. Medicaid, in exchange for rebates, generally covers all drugs, and the administration has said perhaps we should experiment and allow Medicaid, saying we're actually not going to allow all drugs to be on formulary unless there's certain discounts or that can be negotiated, and perhaps all of that will then push down our spending for drugs. And so I expect that you're going to continue to see that. Of course, we do see that now with the VA, and as people continue to look to see what's happening in other countries, I don't think that these conversations are going to go away. I mean, it's hard to do. It's even just having the right administrative structures and processes in place for some of these will make this in many ways a longer term fix. But I do think that there is increasingly a national will to take this on, and could frankly lead to significant reductions in spending both for patients and providers and plans all across the system.
Thanks, Dora. So, Robert, this question's for you from one of our webinar attendees. They want to get your thoughts about what is value. You talk a lot about price differences, but what about the value, and how would you, what does that mean overall when you think about these drug prices increases, and what do you think your readers would think about when they try to figure out what is valuable to them for a new drug?
Well, that's almost sort of it's a difficult to answer question. I think that society's been, struggling to answer, for years, because of course, if you're the one with the near fatal disease, the value of a particular drug, if there's only one or two drugs that might help, I mean, the value to you is sort of almost infinite, right? But I mean, certainly economists and health economists have been, trying to find that. In England, there's a group called, NICE, NICE, or something like that, that actually, evaluates, drugs on a cost basis, kind of like what you get, per life year gained or per quality adjusted life year gain, and sets, limits. So there is a field of economics that does that, and it's, and now there's a group in the U.S., a nonprofit group called ISO that is doing that, for some new drugs, and trying to analyze drugs and say, hey, this drug at this price, is a good value, is not a good value. It would be a good value if the price went down to this. But it's a very complicated and fraught area, I think, in part because, from what I understand, you're doing the analysis of coming up with, this drug is, 50,000 per quality adjusted life year, 100,000 per quality adjusted life year. That's very sensitive to the clinical trials you use to input the information. So it's a hard analysis to do. You can come to different conclusions depending on precisely what trials you do and what the data you feed into your model. And then again, if you're the one with the disease, with the rare disease, the kind of value to you is very, very high, and you just want it. Period.
Good point. So building on that, what Robert just said, Samir, does Kaiser use the organization that Robert referred to, ICER, which tries to evaluate medications, new medications, or and figure out what the value is? Is that something Kaiser looks at, or do you do your own internal process?
We do both. ICER often puts out things publicly, and we often take a look at about what they say. But the reason why the process works well for us, and why I'm so happy to be part of Kaiser Permanente is because the formulary is actually developed by the physicians and the pharmacists. So if there's a new drug that treats a neuromuscular dystrophy that's come out, then our neuromuscular neurologists would take a look at the information. And hopefully, if there's a couple of options, then we can tell our pharmacy colleagues, okay, these drugs are equivalent, go out and see what you can get the best price on. So I think we're always in the situation of offering the best quality based on evidence to our patients, which is a very comfortable place for a physician to be, because then there's really no conflict of interest and I can do what's right for my patient. So yes,
right.
Kaiser's monographs do come out and we do peek at them, but we definitely have our own internal process that we look at the literature and come up with recommendations.
So, Dora, given what Samir just outlined and how they can do work at Kaiser where they have the physicians together and the health plan, as far as, you have the providers and the payer essentially one entity that can work together. What about the other payers we have out there? What kind of things can they do since they don't have that sort of relationship with their physicians in their networks?
Well, I think that I think the same may be true for other health plans, meaning that that they do focus on ICER's reviews closely, but many of them have their own process through their own P&T committees where they explore some of these issues. I also think that we're seeing more focus on the patient perspective and what is value. I was at an event recently and heard about Fasta Cures and Avalier have developed a patient perspective value framework as an example. So thinking through from the perspective of the patient, what is value and how can we increasingly use these and other types of frameworks in making medical decisions. I think that FDA is increasingly looking at trying to sort out what is value, both through their patient engagement efforts for the regulatory side, but also even more recently, they finalized guidance that will allow drug companies to share information that's not officially part of its label, but on the healthcare economic information, or present data on how it could reduce cost for hospitalization, as an example, or other metrics that could then help health plans and other payers think through the value of the drug and how they may want to think about coverage and reimbursement payment policies. And so I do think that the whole discussion of value, I think, is really taken off. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about what exactly is value and how to balance the perspectives of the patients and the providers and the plans and others in the process. But I certainly am cheered by, at least at the conversations happening at the highest levels across all the stakeholder groups, so that people are very cognizant about the dangers of not getting it right too. And so even though it's been slow, I do think in this case that being somewhat deliberate is a good thing.
Thanks, Dora. Okay, this is for all the panelists, but I think maybe we'll start with Robert. Here's the question. Do you have a sense about how direct-to-consumer advertising has impacted prices? How impactful would it be to return the days of restricting consumer advertising, or at least prohibiting pharmaceutical companies of claiming advertising as R&D for tax deduction purposes? And related to that, maybe I'm adding this piece on. There's been discussion by the Trump administration about requiring companies to include the prices of their medications in their advertising. So maybe just in general, Robert, if you can talk a little bit about consumer advertising of drugs.
Yeah, so advertising, we're unusual in that, and consumer in the U.S. Advertising on TV of drugs, it's been out there for a long time now. And certainly it helps. I mean, I think, the reason they do it is because it helps sell drugs. I'm not so sure what the link is between prices. I think, it helps get more volume, and certainly, especially with some of the more common drugs or drugs either where there's competition or people may not know about the condition. Obviously it helps familiarize people with the condition they may have. So it helps there. They don't do it because it doesn't work. Spend all that money on it. I'm not sure what the relation between prices and advertising is. If you ban advertising, I'm not sure how it would affect the price. I mean, some of the highest priced drugs are these days are specialty drugs used by a very small percentage of people, such as, cancer pills for rare cancers, or rare disease drugs that aren't advertised. And those are actually some of the highest priced drugs, and cancer drugs, I guess, are advertised sometimes, but less often. I'm not sure if that, I'm just not sure if that would, lower prices, what effect that would have. I mean, I'd be welcome if any other panelists have seen any studies on this. I mean,
Thanks,
and what
Robert.
were the other questions? Was there another question embedded in there?
Well, the one of the other proposals that's being discussed is requiring drug companies to include their list prices on their advertising.
Yes, that was a proposal that the Trump administration has definitely put out there. I don't know what the exact status is of that today, whether they could just require it, whether, that's something they're able to do. But, I mean, certainly, it couldn't hurt, right? I mean, at least, there be some disclosure. Everyone would know, here's exactly the list price for a typical patient. And, transparency, can't hurt.
Thanks. Samir, do you want to talk a little bit about consumer advertising of medications? How does that affect physicians?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me talk about it in general and then how it affects physicians. I think we're only one of two countries in the entire world that allows direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals. And like Robert, I haven't seen the data on whether it actually increases prices, but I'm going to guess it does, because otherwise they would actually stop. The California Association of Health Plans actually showed that 9 out of 10 of the largest pharma companies spent more on direct-to-consumer advertising than research and development. So that tells you something. And Robert, I don't know if you've been watching enough television, but I see the CAR T therapies, which are these new things for cancer antibodies that are really rare, and they're $500,000 therapies are on there. Go ask your doctor about this.
The CAR T drugs are on there now. I've not seen that one.
Yeah, the CAR T
Amazing.
commercials are on there. Yep, seeing them on TV. And you can't watch anything without seeing something about rheumatoid arthritis or psoriasis, etc. And there are cheaper alternatives to these things. Rheumatoid arthritis, the first line therapy is methotrexate. It's pennies. Many.
You mentioned the rheumatoid arthritis drugs. Those are ones with high, with some pretty significant price increases over the years. That is a good example of some pretty significant price increases, and I'll let you talk.
Yeah, no. They're putting the only ones they want to advertise are the ones that they want to make more money and they've increased prices on. You don't see ads for generic drugs, right? And then these haven't been on recently, but I clearly remember the purple pill, Nexium. So the company that used to make omeprazole called Prilosec, the patent ran out. They made a mirror image of the same molecule, changed the color of the pill to purple, and increased the price and advertised the heck out of it. And people ended up buying that. So I do know people will come to my office asking me about a drug they've seen on TV. So I'm definitely happy when my patient is educated. But it sometimes makes it difficult to have a conversation when their mind is set on a particular brand, when there may be 3 or 4 other equivalent kinds of things. So definitely the office visit gets longer.
Dora, you want to add some thoughts on that? And I also just want to remind everyone that we only have 15 minutes left, actually more like 10 minutes. So please, if you have any questions you want to submit, now would be the time. But Dora, do you want to comment on the advertising to consumers?
I agree with Robert and Samir. I haven't seen any studies that have directly quantified how much direct-to-consumer advertising may be increasing the actual price of drugs. I do think that we have data demonstrating that direct-to-consumer advertising increases dramatically the volume of drugs that are prescribed by when patients go in to request the specific prescription, as Samir just described. And so it does increase the quantity sold, and obviously is a very lucrative investment for the companies to make. I would also note, even though certainly President Trump and Secretary Azar made news by including this proposal in their blueprint, but this is not a new proposal. The American Medical Association has long called for restrictions, and actually a few of their resolutions have actually asked that the price of the drugs be included in the ads, or at the very least, perhaps that there's a generic alternative should be mentioned as part of the ads. And so they have mentioned it does increase the demand for particularly newer, more expensive drugs. There's the pressure on the physicians, as Samir alluded to. The tax deduction makes it easier for them to do. So I think for many of these reasons that there is going to be increasing attention on this proposal, certainly now that the administration has put its weight behind it. But I think that perhaps there is a serious chance that this could actually be adopted.
Thanks, Dora. So, Robert, I'm going to start with you on this one. Some of our participants have said that, while pharmaceutical spending has gone up significantly over the last few years, it really accounts only for a small percentage of overall healthcare spending compared to hospitals, physicians, and other services. So why do you think there's so much attention on drug prices? And is it deserved?
Well, I'd say that, one thing is that often the figure that's referred to when they say it's only a small percentage of spending, and clearly hospital spending is more. There's no question about that. That's the biggest chunk. But that often, affects people, towards the, end of life or later in life care, where there's like a huge amount of hospital spending as you get sick towards the end of your life. And also, often the figure that's referred to when you hear the figure that 10 or 12% of spend, only 10 or 12% of spending is prescription drug. Often that figure often is really only outpatient prescription drugs picked up in the pharmacy. But there's a big category, a very fast-growing category of drugs now, like some of these new cancer therapies. These are drugs, doctor-administered drugs. And this is a fast-growing category of drugs that includes some of these complex biologic therapies, like there's all these immunotherapy cancer drugs. They're typically doctor-administered, and those are not captured in the pharmacy data, and that's a fast-growing category. And so that makes it, a bigger number. And then when you add on, and then also, for commercially insured plans, this is somewhat healthier, like employees, like probably a lot of people on their call, the drugs are a higher percentage because you're less likely to be hospitalized. So, the 10 or 12% includes, only outpatient prescription drugs, and doesn't include the doctor-administered drugs, which are becoming a big focus of some of the most expensive brand-name drugs. So, no, yes, it is true. Prescription drugs, aren't the biggest things, but, people are often, exposed to those list prices. If you have a high deductible plan, if you're in Medicare, certain segments of Medicare, you can be exposed to those, or if you are uninsured, or if you have a plan that increasingly makes you pay a percentage of the copay. So people are sometimes, exposed to these prices. So I know that doesn't answer the question in a definitive way, but it's something that people can see and often, are exposed to.
Samir, do you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, sure. I recently saw a figure from the American Association of Health Plans, AAHP. They actually had a 22%. As Robert mentioned, it included not only the outpatient drugs, but the inpatient drugs and the clinically administered types of drugs. So the piece of the pie that the pharmaceutical industry is taking out of healthcare is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they cannot take up 100%. Otherwise, we would not have, any doctors or nurses or buildings or technology. So I would disagree that it is a small amount of the pie. It actually is an increasing amount of the pie. If you look back, even 10 years, or if you look back 20 years, that percentage is continuing to increase and used to be single digits, it's double digits and simply rising. So I don't think it's sustainable.
And Dora, what are your thoughts?
In addition to what Samir and Robert have mentioned, and this is certainly about specialty drugs in particular, when if it accounts for up to like half of the drug spend is for some of these newer specialty drugs, and they're benefiting only 1 to 2% of the patient population. It's a fair it certainly is a fair concern. But I would also point out that we are maybe some of the dramatic increases of prices are getting much of the attention, but I do think that in the past 5-8 years, we certainly have seen renewed attention on hospital delivery reform and care transformation, and how can we better manage whether it's readmissions or coordinated care for patients with a number of chronic conditions. I don't think that it may be outsized attention to drug spending in part because of the Martin Shkreli's of the world, but I don't think that that there's not attention to other cost drivers within the system, and I do think that there is significant effort underway in that sector as well. And I also think we say, well, drug spending maybe on average is 20%, but 20% is a significant proportion of care. And any other budget or any other, whether it's your personal budget or professional, I mean, 20, if something is accounting for 20% of the cost, then of course it's going to receive close scrutiny. So I think that the attention is fair. I think the attention is going to continue to be maintained and probably increased.
Thanks, Dora. So we're almost running out of time, so I'm going to give everyone maybe just 30 seconds, each of the panelists, to get your final thoughts on like one best solution for reducing drug costs, or just any other final thought that you want to leave with the audience. So I'm going to start with, how about Samir? You start.
Well, first, thanks for the opportunity. And I think I offered you 3 things, which were, transparency. How do we come up with these prices, and are those fair? I mean, we don't want the drug companies to stop innovating and go out of business. We definitely want to make sure that prices are transparent and fair, and that we really have true competition. When we have 15 products for multiple sclerosis, why are the costs all going up, including the one that was old? And I really appreciate the great value of some of the life-saving drugs that come out, but don't change the color of the pill and charge me more, or go from twice a day to once a day, or something ridiculous like that, which adds no value on behalf of our patients.
Thanks. That's great. Dora?
I think if my final few words, I would focus maybe more on process. If the comment period at HHS is closing for proposals in response to the Trump plan, then you should have on your radar to start looking for guidance and regulations to start coming out in the fall, winter of this year in terms of how they actually intend to move forward on some of these proposals, and what will the impact be on the various stakeholders in industry. I think that for those that are inclined to comment, there's still plenty of time to comment, and you should actually do so and share real-world examples for whoever you represent, because I think that can be just as influential as any data that you can provide as well. And then finally, you should actually try to go in and meet. You can meet with the agency officials. You can go in and meet with OMB and the Domestic Policy Council in the White House, and you can also go take your concerns to the Hill. That's been quite effective in shaping a number of proposals at CMS, and I think that will continue to be true for whatever comes out as part of the blueprint.
Thanks, Dora. Robert, you have the last word.
Yeah, so I just think this drug pricing issue has been with us a number of years. I don't think it's going away, judging, and I think it's one of the more complicated areas of pricing. And every time I think I understand it, I discover a new complicated wrinkle. And I think one thing certainly to focus on has been a big focus from the administration on the middlemen, and changing the discount system, making it a more upfront pricing system, and reducing some of these very complicated rebate systems that we have now. And that's one thing to watch. Whether that that has an impact or not, because that has been one of their very big focuses, to change it to more of an upfront pricing system instead of all these hidden discounts that go through all sorts of middlemen.
Great. Thanks so much. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have this afternoon, but please, I would like for everyone to take some brief time for a very brief survey that you'll receive via email later today. Again, a recording of this webinar will be available on our website soon, along with the slides, additional reading, and an experts list. I want to thank so much to our speakers and the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation, who helped make today's webinar possible. And thank you, our audience, for joining this afternoon. We had a great turnout, and we hope to have you at another Alliance for Health Policy event soon. And that'll end our presentation today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. You guys were great. Thank you. It was really great.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Bye.